Danny's like all week. He's like, all right, I cannot wait for the Erik Cason to come on. It's going to be completely fucking nuts, but you're going to love him.
That's a pretty good.
That pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, it's a pretty good synopsis of who I am.
Well, look, welcome. Good to finally have you on the show. It's been a long time coming. Do you know what's funny in the last one? So we do notes for the shows, and sometimes I don't. I even refer to them, but sometimes I do. But I'd opened Eric's notes, and I was looking. So I had Mark Moss in, and I was like, "So you just dropped a book?" I was like, "Has he just dropped a book?" So
Did you have the whole
notes?
thing?
No, I ended up switching it around, but I did have the wrong notes. Anyway, Erik, how are you?
I'm good. Strung out from the concert, but or from the conference. Well, in the conference, I went to a concert last night too.
Who'd you go and see?
Tin Liquor. They're part of the Anjuna Deep label. They're they're pretty big in the UK actually.
What kind of music is it?
Deep house.
Yeah, it's not my thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I listen to Slayer and Megadeth and shit like that.
Oh.
Congratulations on the book. I haven't read it.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming. I've read some of it, but
Danny usually gets them read in time, but yeah, congratulations. Tell me about the book first, and then we'll get going.
Well, the book, it didn't start as a book. It just started as a series of essays that I was just kind of writing, exploring philosophical and sociological content of Bitcoin. And sort of as I got deeper and deeper, I was like, whoa, there's like all these threads sort of connecting. So the book I can really say is more of like a constellation of a greater incomplete work that I'm sort of working on now that's trying to essentially do an entire philosophical approach towards, I guess, what we call like the sociology of cryptography or something like that.
We did consider doing mushrooms for this episode.
Well, I mean, it would be really nice, but then I got to get on my flight kind of all weird and stuff. And I'm just not sure how that would go with TSA. I've had some close calls like that before.
I don't really do mushrooms as well, so I'd be completely lost.
I don't do acid on planes anymore.
Anymore.
Yeah, there was an incident once, so I decided I was like, it's time to throttle back on that. Really great way to pass 8 hours on a plane.
Yeah, please tell me. So
there's not much to tell you. Because everybody's always like, you're going to take it and you're just going to flip out on the plane, right? No, like you sit down and you're like, I'm going 600 miles through the air, 30,000 feet in the air. Like, this is amazing. And if the plane just bursts into flames, I'm going to meet God now. It doesn't matter. I can't do anything. So I'm just going to look outside and see all the amazing mountains and the clouds and how incredible and extraordinary it all is.
Did you see that guy get dragged off a plane recently? It was going to Ibiza and had to do an emergency landing, I think in Marseille, and they dragged him off the plane because he was off his nut.
No, I didn't see that.
Absolutely off his nut.
It's probably like a weekly occurrence from there.
Yeah, I was thinking, what are you doing drugs on a plane?
Yeah. So, it's, I decided that it was cutting it a little too close. So we're not doing that anymore just for me and everyone else's safety.
Just a gin and tonic will do.
Exactly.
So what's your philosophy background?
I don't have one.
You don't have it? Even better. Okay. But you are a philosopher.
No, I'm not a philosopher at all. I eschew when anyone tries to call me a philosopher. Maybe I could pass for a thinker. I always say I'm a strategist at best. So,
how do you get classed as a philosopher? Isn't that a choice?
Well, no. Essentially, like this was all compelled by when I got into Bitcoin. I had this moment that I was like, how is it possible that this piece of technology can keep its oath to itself in a way that like no man, no institution, no government, no organization seems to be capable of? And it was like a splinter in my mind. And I was like, all right, really smart people have thought about this before me. So like, let's do some Googling about the oath and the philosophy. And I came across this philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, and I got a book of his called The Sacrament of Oath, The Archaeology of Language. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really good. It's like the 4th book in like a 9-book series called Homo Secur. And now I've read the whole series. And essentially in it, like he's doing a whole archaeology of like, what is the oath? How did it function? How did it come about? And he kind of like goes all the way back to pre-Roman times. And it was like, the oath really is like this object of language that fuses magic, religion, and words into a singular that actually has nothing to do with the content that's spoken, but it has to do with the actualization of what's been promised. And so this then marries up with an individual called Homo Secur, who's like the forsaken man throughout human history, who all legal systems have always given themselves a right and a decree to destroy these people, but it's not murder. And most interestingly is that these people can't be used in ritualized sacrifices either, because it's about putting them outside the purview and the protection of the gods. So like they can't have anything to do with religion. And what's pretty interesting is that like essentially there have been these like non-peoples throughout human history that could always be destroyed by the state because of the way that like they're the other bad people and they pose a threat to the entire system. So like they must be destroyed. And so following the lineage of that person, I kind of like connected that up to modernity and seeing how like now we live in a constant state of emergency where like any of us can be labeled as a terrorist or any enemy combatant. And not only like do we just not only are we in prison, but like access to the law itself is fundamentally impossible. Like we can't even get habeas corpus. So yeah, it's been a pretty interesting journey. And then there's like, you know, like 10 other philosophers that like on the concourse of it, he like mentioned that. I have to like go on the journey to read them. And I'm also dealing with like a lot of these thinkers you can't approach in academia because they're like sullied with backgrounds either in like communism or like radical fascism or other things. So like the moment that you start reading them, people are like, you got to get out of academia. Like you're not welcome here.
Why?
Specifically, so like Heidegger, for example. Heidegger is really sullied because not only did he belong to the Nazi Party, but it seems like a lot of his philosophy actually deals with trying to like actualize a political party that explicitly can identify friend and enemy classes for like the evolution of that political ideal. And so, in my opinion, dealing with Heidegger and understanding him very intently so that you can make a criticism of him is essential. Like if you actually want to make your way through the course of phenomenological philosophy and like actually like make your way past Heidegger. So are you saying there's like a whole class of philosophers or philosophy that is essentially kind of censored? Absolutely. One of the guys that a more contemporary fellow, his name is Michael Millerman. He was from the University of Toronto, but brilliant scholar. He was studying Heidegger like pretty intensely. And he essentially got canceled from the University of Toronto and was intimidated and sort of forced out.
Well, it is Canada. It's not surprising.
Yeah, well,
we're ragging on Canada a lot recently.
Yeah, have you registered yourself yet for the?
We don't have to yet.
Okay.
Yeah, because we don't make $10 million in revenue. But if there's a bull market, no, it's the platforms, and if you make more than $10 million, I don't know if that's podcasts in Canada or anyone.
What do you mean, as in based in Canada?
Like, do you have to be based in Canada, or if we want to disseminate our content in Canada?
Don't know. Probably based in Canada, I would guess.
I would have thought the latter, actually, because otherwise, how can
we don't make $10
$10
million yet, so.
Yeah, we're close.
After this pod, though.
9.5 million. Okay, so the background to is they're seen as dangerous words?
Yeah, I mean, like another philosopher I deal a lot with is Carl Schmitt, and so like Schmitt was like he was a member of the Nazi Party, and specifically what I think is the most damning of Schmitt is he actually wrote the legal defense for Hitler during the Night of the Long Knives that essentially justified why that state of emergency was used, and that really sort of solidified from a legal perspective that like Hitler's decree was the law itself. And interestingly enough, like Schmitt was actually arrested and imprisoned for like 3 years to go on trial at Nuremberg, but they just eventually felt like he didn't have enough evidence. And the biggest irony is that Schmitt actually wrote I think it was in 1931, on the concept of the political. And this specifically was talking about like the crisis that the Weimar Republic was facing, and that essentially if Chancellor von Hindenburg didn't use the clause of Article 38 in the Constitution to declare a state of emergency and ban both the Nazis and the communists, that the Weimar Republic would be in crisis. So ironically enough, this didn't see its way into the hands of the chancellor. And so when he was ousted and Hitler came to power, it turned out Hitler was actually kind of a fan of Schmitt's work. And Hitler read it and he was like, that's like Clause 38 thing. Like this is what we use to destroy the Weimar Republic.
Okay, so what do we lose by limiting the kind of scope of books that are studied?
I mean, everything. Like that's sort of the contextual space that we can have to actually criticize these works. Like look, like like Mein Kampf should be read, not because it's brilliant, because it's absolutely stupid.
Okay.
Like it's just an idiotic framework. And like as soon as you read it, you go, oh, like this Nazism thing is actually like really stupid. Like there's not really much substance to it. I mean, even in the Nuremberg trials, when they asked Schmidt about Hitler, he like sighed and was dismissive. He was like, I can't even discuss his ideology because I find it so superfluous.
Well, what is the TLDR? Because I haven't read Mein Kampf. I doubt. Have you read it?
No.
I doubt I will.
The TLDR is essentially that like Aryan individuals have a superior place in the world because they lead German culture, and German culture has helped develop the West on a whole, and that needs to be defended against all of the individuals who aren't part of German culture that are invading Germany, and we need to get Leichenraum in order to expand German culture and people, and that we always need to be aggressive and warring against the other people that are trying to come into us. And so like we need to expand the Aryan people as much as possible, make as many of them, and destroy anybody that tries to threaten that.
So it's elitism.
Elitism fused with a general nationalism that then wants to try to create a hierarchical order of people.
Right. Okay. And so, how have you picked the rabbit hole for you to go to that eventually gets you to crypto sovereignty?
It's pretty interesting. Well, so like after the Occupy Wall Street movement, like I was exposed to all of those things, and it was very clear to me that money was substantially broken, and it was also very clear to me that we couldn't use the political system to make that operable. So for me, I just fell into a crushing depression where I was like, there's no conceivable way to solve any of this problem. Like, how do you neutralize this money problem that's so endemic? So like in my crushing depression, I was just like, well, like maybe that's it. Maybe I just need to like end it. There's like no good. We can never make anything happen. So I had like, somebody had essentially like whispered to me at Occupy about Bitcoin and how this was like the answer.
What year was Occupy? Was that 2011?
2011.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was like early 2012 that like all this stuff was percolating. And so I like looked up some stuff about Bitcoin, and I was like, oh, like this is really interesting, and kind of let it percolate a little. And then I came across an article about people that were essentially like doing money laundering in between China and Singapore, like using Bitcoin. And I had wrote my senior thesis at university on the East Asian financial crisis and capital controls. So I was like really intrigued. I was like, capital controls are really powerful. And if you can get around the Chinese Communist government capital controls, like that's pretty essential. So like now the Bitcoin thing had really sparked up for me. And I was getting into it, reading a lot more about it. But there was all these like lingering questions about like, how is this even working? Like I get it technologically, but like why can it make a money when like no government can adequately make a money? Like, and then I did the research on all the cypherpunk stuff, and I was like, oh, okay, this is making sense. And then from Occupy, I'd really gone from being like a far left socialist or communist to like a full on anarchist, and that's really kind of the change that I went under Occupy. And so for me, anarchism was like a sufficient inoculation to be able to like explore both radical communist and radical fascist theory and be able to kind of pick and choose what works for me, what doesn't work for me. And I think that piece of being like inoculated vis-a-vis anarchism, because to me it was like, I admit that the state is an apparatus of violence and we can't use it at all. And like both fascism and communism see those as key components. But like what else can we maybe learn from these theories? Like is there anything of value here? And in my opinion, there's a lot of valuable stuff. It's just understanding where all of the pitfalls are and that how it essentially becomes a violent apparatus of destruction vis-a-vis statism and the authority that it tries to decree to people.
Okay, so that shift from radical socialism to anarchism, was that an actual shift, or was that an evolution of your ideas, your worldview, where you actually realize what it is the issues you have in the world, or the complications you see, or the problems you see with the state? Actually, you thought socialism was the solution, but really it's anarchism. Potentially.
Yes, and like the actual like point of change was when I was in Philadelphia at like the Occupy National Gathering, and we had assembled at the Peaceful Assembly Monument that's on the National Monument Mall. And the police told us to like get lost, and we're like, no, you don't understand. This is like the Freedom to Assemble Memorial. They're like, we're telling you. And I was like, but you don't. Then they got the truncheons out and started beating the shit out of me, right on top of the memorial too. And I remember like as he's like hitting me, like I have this thought. I was like, oh, like the state is not my friend. Like these people aren't going to help us ever. And that was kind of like my big radical shift in understanding that like the state wasn't actually this thing that was going to help us out.
So what brought you to radical socialism then? What is it? What is it about you?
So I grew up in the Western United States in California. So I grew up in woo-woo liberal California with everything feels really good. And like one of the really important things about socialism that I want to honor is like it feels really good. Like this is like a really great idea that we want everybody to understand and get on board with. We should like share stuff that's like important, and there's like a common and community. I think the problem is that all of those feel good feelings, those are oughts as opposed to like what is. And like what is as good as we have those feelings, like there are very real limits to what we can provide. Like as much as we do centrally plan something and saying we're going to provide this for everybody, there is actual corruptions and limits to it. So I think for me, that experience of getting beaten was understanding that as much as this shouldn't be happening, it is. And why is it happening? And why do things like this happen? And for me, it was realizing that like, oh, this like apparatus of violence where people decide that like, hey, if you don't do the thing I tell you, I'm going to hurt you, which seems like a really basic thing. But I really realized like kind of starkly, I was like, oh, like this is the thing that like runs the entire world, is like this entire module of punishment and discipline and trying to create an orderly world, which it does really, really well. But there's all these tertiary issues that come out from it that aren't really well connected to it.
Such as?
Well, such as if we want to look at the largest polluters in the world, like it's the U.S. military. And so like there's this endemic problem of that violence is a very real and endemic problem, but violence on a state-based level is a whole nother game. And that's one that we all comply to and act like it's a totally normalized thing, that if somebody just doesn't comply, that using violence to get their compliance is good.
Well, it's slightly different where we're from because we don't have guns. So they might hit you with a truncheon, but it's very rare that a police officer shoots someone. It's like a big deal
when that happens.
It's a huge deal.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. It usually leads to some form of protest. We had riots in South London a few years back on the basis of it. It goes in. There's a massive investigation. There's actually a situation at the moment recently where a marksman shot somebody and killed them, and he's now being tried for murder. And a number of because we don't have many cops with guns, we have some. We have like armed response or at the airports. A number of them have come in and handed in their guns because they don't want to run the risk of having to use their gun in the line of work and risk being tried for murder.
Well, are you held accountable just like a normal citizen who chose to shoot somebody?
It depends on the situation, but every shooting will have an investigation. But this one, I don't know the details of it, but I just know he's now going to be tried for murder. And that's particularly rare. I couldn't even tell you the last time that's happened. But
yeah, I would say most of the time they're not treated the same way.
Okay. Because like here in the United States, like police officers get certain immunities for when they use their gun, particularly if like they say like, I felt like my life was in danger. And I think like there's only been like 21 officers like convicted throughout the history of the United States, like being put on trial for murder, like using their gun, like while in action. And so like that's like a massive imbalance. And so to me, again, like the problem of the state is essentially saying, hey, there are people out there that can use their firearms. They're going to get special protection under the law. And they're also going to have a very cozy relationship with the prosecutors when they do come to do that. And to me, like this is a pretty gross abortion of justice. And it also communicates very clearly to police officers like, hey, if you shoot somebody in the line of duty, probably aren't going to be held responsible.
So it's the monopoly of violence that I listened to a podcast. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Sam Harris. I know it won't be popular. And I'm sure he was arguing that the monopoly of violence was the best thing we gave the government because it leads to net less violence. I'm just telling you, that's what I read. But when I heard that and I thought in terms of the United States, I thought, actually, that might be less true. I think it's potentially more true in the UK.
It's interesting that there's that dynamic that sort of exudes itself.
Because we don't have guns.
Yeah, and I think that that's a pretty interesting example because, yeah, like the monopoly on violence, we could say in theory is working out pretty well there. And we look at the United States, we'd say, like not having a monopoly on violence here doesn't seem to be working out so well.
But I'm purely guessing. I could be entirely wrong.
But one of the main problems is that, like, all right, that works for a specific limited duration, but, like, now we end up getting ourselves into, like, Germany in 1930. Like, you know, we disarm the whole population. Like, hey, this is really great. There aren't any more firearm deaths. Like, now we have a population that we don't really like, that we start bullying a whole bunch. Turns out we really don't like them and we want to steal all their stuff. Turns out we actually hate them entirely, and we don't even want them to be German citizens, and we want to extinguish them.
Yeah.
And so now we're talking about the wholesale murder of 2 million people. And so, like, to me, like, this is the big problem, is that monopoly on violence can, like, unhinge itself and then decides that, like, I'm just going to kill an entire swath of the population that's not complying with it. And it'll be one of those, just like Nazi Germany, but essentially, like, every decade we've watched this play out again and again and again. Whether it was the genocide in Armenia in the 1920s, or Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1990s, or even with the unhinging that we watched happen in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, there's always this really extreme risk that the state says, we're going to declare a state of emergency. We're going to label a class of people as an enemy. We're going to strip them of all abilities and rights to protect themselves, and then we're going to destroy them. And like the lecture I gave in Riga was actually, I tried to point out that like, those are actually like very inefficient genocides, because like a genocide is really about population control. And so the development that we saw between the death camps and concurrently with like the Chinese re-education camps, to me, like the Chinese Uyghur genocide is like the perfect genocide, because you're destroying a people's culture entirely. You're liquidating their language. You're liquidating their God. You're liquidating their sense of identity. You're doing forced integration, forced linguistic integration of those people. And furthermore, you have a total surveillance panopticon at the end. So after you've completely obliterated this human being as an individual, clean them out of all identity that they have, now you have a vacant husk of a human that you can say, you're our permanent slave, we're watching you forever, and if you do anything against us, we'll hurt you and your family. Now go be a good slave for us out in the world. And this is a much more efficient model of genocide, because you get to keep the bodies. You get to use them for yourself. Whereas all the other genocides just said, well, let's just do whole-scale murder of those people.
So if you wanted to sell this as a concept to British people, maybe even Australians now, because Australia got rid of their guns after Port Arthur. We have guns, but like you have to jump through so many hoops. Usually you're a farmer or a shooter, or you have to be locked in like 12 cases, and you have all these licensing checks, but people basically don't have guns. I don't know anyone with a gun. To sell this, if you just had a referendum in the UK, me and Danny both agree less than 1% would vote for guns. So you'd have to convince them the reason you need this is for a potential future government that may want to strip you of civil liberties and end up murdering, committing a genocide here. People would not believe that could happen in the UK.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we don't have any references of the UK ever committing genocides against people. Like that doesn't happen.
No, we killed a lot of people in other countries. I think we killed a lot of people in India.
Well, I was going to point out, what was it, East Pakistan, and kind of how that unhinged, and then there was India during World War II, and kind of the and like this is an important one, is it's not just about killing people, but it's also about using the guns to prevent them from the rights to life. Because like some of the most efficient genocides that we saw, like the Ukrainian genocide in the 1930s, or the Great Leap Forward in China, that was just about stealing all the people's food and then making sure they couldn't get any more by any means.
So I guess the attraction to Bitcoin is a technology that truly the government can't control, interfere with, and it gives you the ability to operate outside of the government. But is it also something that you look at that can strip power and size of government?
Yeah, and it's interesting because as it increases individual power, like that individual power then counters sort of collectivized power vis-a-vis the state. And like the quintessential example is fiat money. And like the thing that I'm really pedantic about that we were talking about earlier is like what's going on in Israel right now is absolutely horrific. And everyone has strong opinions about it, and nothing's going to stop the killing right now. And it's tragic. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that like when you actually like zoom in, it's really interesting that you see like the Palestinians all have like a bunch of American guns. So like there's a very real connection and process of that like my country created armaments and weapons of death. They somehow circulated around the globe and found themselves in the hands of Palestinians who are now using that to commit death and destruction around the world. And my frank truth is like, I want nothing to do with that. Actually, I radically want nothing to do with that. I'm going to do everything in my power to separate myself from that. And to me, that's what Bitcoin represents, is now when my government says, hey, we're going to send, $20 billion to Ukraine, or we're going to send $6 billion to Iran, or, wherever they're sending money, I actually have a way to say, you know what? I'm not down for this anymore. I'm going to put my money in Bitcoin. I know you guys will call me criminal and do whatever you want to me. But to me, this is ethical. And like, if you guys were really just building roads and like doing good social programs, absolutely, I would be willing to come to the table. But you're not. You're using it for military weapons of war that are designed to destroy people. And what's even more important is today, like, it's not just like normalized weapons that like bang, bang, you're dead. Like, we have made weapons of mass destruction and biochemical weapons that are designed to kill everyone equally. Like, this is a crisis for all of humanity that up until 1945, we hadn't ever been able to experience as a people. And now our idea of winning is a nuclear holocaust on the other side of the border where everyone and everything is completely destroyed and that area of the world can't be occupied for centuries. Like, what kind of insane bananas is this that you want me to go along with this?
Well, what is it about the evolution of violence that leads us to this? Is it we always have to have bigger, better, faster weapons, hyper? Because it's not even just nuclear weapons. It's better aircraft, faster aircraft that can't be detected by radar. It's hypersonic missiles. It's small nukes. It's like a constant arms race that essentially exists in everything. It exists within mobile phones. It's Google versus iPhone. It's I'm trying to think of other examples. I mean, cars. It's Tesla versus GM. There's this
that light up there.
Yeah.
It's everything. It's
like within us to build them great, better things.
Yeah, and like one of the things that I think is that in the development of technology and the methods and modes that it made, like, and like this is a very long and complex story about history, but essentially, like at the end of World War II, what happened was I think we saw the complete annihilation of statism as we understand it, and its replacement with like a hyper state of legalized lawlessness that exists inside of a total state of emergency, where the entirety of the economy had been committed towards the development of war and accentuating that war, specifically in light of, there's the Cold War going on. We need to continue to escalate our arms race against the USSR in such a way. And what's really interesting is that, like, we got asymmetric cryptography out of this. So, like, all this development of crazy hyper technology for war got us all the way up to, like, where we are today with Bitcoin. And I think that that's, like, a really interesting and ironic development that, like, because, I mean, really the only thing that was more important in World War II than the development of computer for cryptic analysis was probably the development of the atomic bomb. But, like, secondary, like, developing cryptic analysis was, like, one of the most important things. And I find it very strange that somehow the preeminent weapon that was developed during World War II, like, broke itself out of its militarized cage and, like, was given to the people as, like, a defensive technique for them to protect themselves. And so, like, I think that this like hyper development of war was on the concourse and path to essentially destroy all of us. But for some very strange reason, one might call it serendipitous, I would call it providential, there happened to be these hidden things lying inside of technology that almost at the very bottom, it could invert the entire order of things and present itself to be a very radically empowering tool for individuals.
Because I've seen the arguments that Bitcoin will end wars and stop wars. By the way, I don't buy that. We had an arms race before 1971, before we came off the gold standard. I don't think Bitcoin ends wars, but I could see the loose connection to the breakdown of the state and localism kind of ends large-scale wars and ends up breaking down armies. I just don't know if Bitcoin actually does do that.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because, like, war is such a large and encompassing term.
Yeah.
And so, like, I've been using the term infinity war. And so for me, it's about breaking the infinity war, which is like this long and continuous thing that the state does in order to create international global conflict so that, like, arms individuals, weapons manufacturers and all the other people, like all the other vultures can come in and, sprinkle around destruction and make a bunch of money for themselves at the cost of everybody else. And so I think we get to break that apparatus. Do localized conflicts end? Probably not. Is there still going to be violence in the world? Absolutely. Do the incentives change in a very radical and different way to get people to the table in a way that they've never been before? I think so. And I don't think we'll necessarily know or see what that looks like until there is a large political contingency of Bitcoiners who are actually utilizing Bitcoin through a political praxis saying, we are doing something else with our common wealth together, and we're going to choose to no longer participate with yours.
So it feels like everything that you studied and you've learned and all the worldviews that you've had that have evolved, all kind of pointed to this world of Bitcoin, where you've discovered a thing that's like, okay, now there is a thing that can actually perhaps solve some of these problems that I've seen in the world. Almost like, is it a case of the Bitcoin was the eureka moment that therefore gave you the kind of direction for this to be like your life's work? And I know that sounds all profound, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, and like my story is a bit unique kind of in the concourse of that, because like, you know, I was pretty early on, and like when I like took the orange pill, it was like a very insane moment for me, where like I like took like a bunch of, you know, like unsecured debt that like I didn't have, and I just like longed that into Bitcoin like an insane person.
Love it.
And I had family members and people that were like pretty concerned, and they're like, hey, like we know you're doing like weird gambling stuff. We're like really concerned because like you're just coming out of like a pretty crippling depression and like you don't have any money. And I was talking to my wife at the time, and she was just like, look, like I don't know if this is going to work for you or not. She was like, but two things I do know. One is that like we don't have this money anyways. So like if you lose it all, like what? Like we're bankrupt? Like we already are bankrupt. She was like, two, like if this does work, you will hate yourself for the rest of your life, and like that will destroy you, and that like you missed your boat. So she was like, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but
do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So just like smash by. And then it just like kind of worked out kind of serendipitously that like I'd been applying to Coinbase and did a couple of interviews, didn't get them. But then like Olaf kind of called me up freaking out, and he was like, hey man, like we're scaling hard. Like, did you want in? I was like, yeah, like let's set up another interview. He was like, oh no, like you're like hired. We're like going to send you a machine right away. Like just like start working now. It's like, okay.
Olaf Carson Wee.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, you say pretty early on you smash by, but like there's a reality with Bitcoin. Once you've done a cycle of 5-6 years, you care less about the gains. It becomes different. I think almost every person I've met, it's become more about meaning. It's like, okay. And I don't know if that's because like maybe they've got themselves into a financial position where there's less fear, right? I've done a cycle, I've smash bought, you know, I'm in a better, comfortable financial position. I've got breathing room, right? Or it's because you go down all these other rabbit holes and you're like, oh, the world's completely fucked and I've got this thing that can maybe just make the world a bit better. I think I need to do that. I'm not sure which it is. Maybe it's a combination of the two.
Well, I think they operate dynamically with each other, because like you like have this thing, it like goes up, you know, like 100%, 200%. You're like, oh my God, I just made a life-changing amount of money. And like now it goes up another 200, 300%. And you're like, okay, like now this is becoming like a lot more money than I ever thought it was. And instead of you just being like sell immediately, you're like, maybe I'm like missing something here. Like maybe this is actually like more valuable than just like gold on the internet or something. And as you start researching it more, you're like, there's like this really interesting thing of cryptography in it. Like why is it using this artistry of warfare to like protect its communications? Like that's really weird. You know, and like as you essentially go farther and farther down the rabbit hole, you learn that a lot of the stuff that you were taught at, you know, school and university, not only is it not true, but it's kind of like the opposite of the truth.
Yeah.
And there's like a bunch of stuff like that. And then you start connecting all over the line. You're like, what if this like Keynesian thing is like all wrong? Like what if that like the state monetary theory of money is actually just like this horrific apparatus used to like generally steal from populations and then redistribute it for purposes of war? That's no good. And like and then it just keeps continuing farther and farther and farther until you're like pretty far down the rabbit hole and you're like talking to your like family and friends about conspiracies about keeping people away from sunlight and other things. And then you're like, oh no, I'm one of these people now.
Well, it's a really fine line to walk, and I actually try and walk it really delicately.
You actually do an incredible job out of kind of everybody. And like that's why I think you have like a pretty popular podcast, because you can engage with insane people like me and be like, okay, like you're pretty crazy, but like there's some interesting stuff here.
Yeah, well, so look, if I'm going to try and orange pill my friends next week, this is not the show I send them.
Yeah, like don't like if somebody's like, I got this new book called Cryptosovereignty on Bitcoin, I think it's like take it away from them and be like, you can have this back after your next cycle.
Yeah, this is a luxury for us and the Bitcoiners who sat through a bear market, who want some entertainment, want to learn something, want to go a bit deeper. But there's this really fine line to walk, twofold. Firstly, though we share a language, British people are very different from Americans. And if I act like like some of the Americans I know, especially the people in Republican states, people are going to think I'm insane. I'm going to get, and I'm just not the same anyway. But also, I want to orange pill as many people as possible. So I want to get those like gentle introductions. I want them to understand like this is inflation and this is why you need to think about it, not what everybody's learned 4 or 5 years down the rabbit hole, like avoiding sunshine, only eating meat, and destruction of the state, and we're all going to be anarchists living a voluntary life, because that's too far. It's also too far for me.
Sure.
I'm fucking 6 years in with this podcast, and that's still too big a leap for me. I'm still in the world where, confession time, I think the state is a natural monopoly and it's going to be here, so I want to work within it and improve life. Like, I'm still there, but it's a very hard line to walk. I've no question with that. It's just a statement.
I mean, I think all that line's pretty good, and I can understand why, like, you're not an anarchist and you still think the state is a necessary apparatus.
Oh, no, not a necessary. That's a different point, because there's two arguments. There's a natural monopoly.
Okay.
I think if you destroy the state, it rebuilds itself in one way or another. So if you had the big red button, suddenly government's gone, people are going to organize themselves into groups, and once they've organized themselves into groups, they're going to also organize themselves into bigger groups to protect themselves from other groups, and then in doing so, they're going to have to elect a council of leaders, and I think you always end up rebuilding the state. I think there is a natural formation of the state. Ideally, it's just a smaller, less violent one all the time. So I just think it's natural. What I do is, in accepting it, I want to use it to make the world a better place.
I can accept that.
You don't have to accept that. You can say, fuck you, your status quo.
Well, so what I just want to point out again is, like, similar to the term of war, the state's kind of one of these confusing things. Because, like, we had something that we could call a state that occurred before 1648, which was when the Treaty of Westphalia was, and that's when we got, like, the modern nation state, was after the 30 Years' War. But before that, like, the state was this sort of weird apparatus of, like, overlapping sovereignty. And, like, that's what the Holy Roman Empire was that, like, you could think of it like as like a pretty loose federal republic. And my idea is that, like, look, if we can beat back the contemporary nation state as we understand it and the apparatus that it uses to finance and create itself vis-a-vis fiat money, like, this thing can atrophy and fall apart.
Yeah.
And, like, my gigantic dream is more or less to, like, each nation state today that's federated in such a way has a number of states underneath it. I want to radicalize those states underneath it to fight their own federal government. Because the thing is that whether it is, what is it in the UK? Is it's not states, is it? Is it?
We have counties, but they're all the same laws. You've got some devolution of power across the United Kingdom between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. They can set certain different rules. For example, they can't. I don't think they can have different taxation, but they can spend their budgets differently. I think higher education is still free in Scotland. There's things, so they can set different laws. But there's been a lot of talk of devolution of power I don't know the county level or city level, but I know maybe regional. I know the north often feels like London gets all the benefits of the country and they were like devolved power. But essentially, we don't have a republic. We have one country, one set of rules.
Yeah, and what I see is that whether it's like counties or states or even cities, like there's a totally new methodology that we can use to create a political form that, because of our current structure, like we can't actualize or try to make those new systems. And so, like, as an anarchist, part of what I believe is that, like, we have to tear down the nation state, one, to, help make sure that humanity on a whole isn't endangered by this insane apparatus. But two is so that we can actually create the space to allow for the building of what comes after this. And the other thing I was going to point out is that, like, on a whole, it generally seems that, like, state, county, city governments are usually actually, like, relatively decent bureaucratic apparatus. It tends to be these federal nation states that have created these deep state programs and these, like, military counterintelligence programs that, like, this seems to be all of the really bad stuff.
Yeah.
And it seems like in the Republican model that is supposed to be the United States, like, states are supposed to arrest federal authority around this. But really, since 1865, like, we've sort of lived in this sort of weird territory in the United States where, like, it's not clear if the 10th Amendment actually has any substantial meaning.
What's the 10th Amendment?
10th Amendment is that anything that is not enumerated to the federal government in the Constitution directly is supposed to be reserved for the states. But as we've seen over the last, 150 years, it's pretty radically different from that.
Yeah. So I always think, I want to go then why? If I went down a philosophical rabbit hole, I think, and me and Danny were talking about this yesterday, he said, like, you love politics. And it's not because I'm a statist, I'm just intrigued by politics. I'm intrigued why the state exists. And just as a reaction to people saying, in the world of Bitcoin, we should dismantle the state. The state is awful, and I fundamentally agree. But I also want to go why, and then I wonder: is the reason we have the state and an evil, growing bureaucratic state? Is it because of technology? Is it the alignment between human greed, psychopaths, and technology?
If you want a TLDR for it, yeah, that's a pretty good one. And the answer to that question is much bigger. And it actually deals with this dude on the cover of my book. That's Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. And so Thomas Hobbes, who, was from the UK, and he wrote this specifically, I think for maybe George I. I can't remember the exact king he wrote it for, but this was really the first treatise of statecraft. It was written in 1648. And there's a great line in there where he's pretty much like, the reason that we need the absolute power of the sovereign is that without without that unifying component of the law, there's no arts, there's no science, there's no development, there's no economy. We can't have everything, and life is short, nasty, and brutish, under the conditions of the state of nature. Which and particularly in 1648, I think this was in the middle of the Long Parliament when he actually released it. So there was a civil war going on. He was noticing a lot of really nasty stuff. And this was also in the back end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, where 20% of the male population died over the course of 30 years, So this was an extremely brutal and barbaric conflict that he saw that was we need something to stop this. So get the nation state works pretty well. Actually, it works shockingly well, and it's able to consolidate power in all ways, shapes, and forms. We get up to the American Civil War. Now we get the development of the Gatling gun. The technology of war itself starts developing and evolving in a really, really maniacal way. And so when the American Civil War came about, we had never seen men killed this quickly or this efficiently in combat. And that whole thing sort of carried out all the way till World War II, where the advancement and development was the preeminent technique of war now is we get aerial bombardments at 30,000 feet that start firestorms around cities that kill hundreds of thousands of people. That's not war, that's just annihilation. And this is the thing that sort of technology allowed to break out of its cage, was that no longer did men need to stand across each other and stab each other or shoot each other, but we could just bomb out an entire city, and now that was the justification for what we're going to do as war. And that's its continued development since then. Because what's really interesting is even in World War II, all the way up until even during the bombing of London, the strikes were relatively strategic, but when they started to drift, that's when Churchill got fucking pissed, and he went and did the bombing of Dresden in response to it.
So then it's kind of interesting that the growth of the state, the increase in control, increase in bureaucracy, increase in violence comes from the evolution of technology. And you can look at that and say, okay, you talked about the Gatling gun, but if you go much, much closer now, it's the CCTVs, it's surveillance state, it's the internet, it's mobile technology, it's satellites, but it's the technology of money that's also given more control. And so then it's really interesting that the thing that will, again, hopefully decentralize us away from such bureaucracy in large states is, again, technology and the technology of money.
Yeah, it's I think it's the second to last essay in my book here. It's based off of Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology. And in this essay, Heidegger's trying to deal fundamentally with what is that thing that actually is the essence that compels technology itself. And there's an interesting line that he gets from Holderman in it, where it's where the danger grows, the saving power is also. And to me, it's sort of as the state itself accelerates the development of all of these tools of war and surveillance and control, that vis-a-vis asymmetric cryptography, at the very bottom of this, there's this way to essentially deploy cryptography in it, and it inverts the ordering and the structure of everything. And now like all of these tools that were once used to actually harm us, like become tools that we can actually use to protect us. And that was sort of the magnificent thing that was just lying waiting at the bottom of Bitcoin. And not just that, but like Satoshi like pretty miraculously like gathered together these very important pieces and just like put them together just right. So that like all of the incentives aligned, and then it like turned out pretty much all of the things that we needed to do it not only does really well, but it does phenomenally well.
You know, end-to-end cryptography has been banned in the UK.
What?
Tell him, Danny.
So they just passed the online safety bill, another bill for our safety, which...
Are we going to be safer?
No, of course not. But what it means is that any end-to-end encrypted services effectively need to offer like a backdoor, which means it's not encrypted.
Signal, etc.
And I think...
Why? Like, don't they get that like this just means it doesn't work?
Exactly. But so the Signal have said that they're going to, assuming this bill is now passed, but assuming they actually implement it the way they think, Signal are just going to leave, and everyone else will. And obviously, you can't actually ban end-to-end encryption, but because you can just do it on your computer or whatever. But,
sure.
But it's a huge deal.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we should expect a lot more of this. You know, and like I can't help but think of the quote from the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, where John Perry Barlow specifically says, like, you're terrified of your own children because like they have access to a power that like is beyond your understanding, and that like you'll sell. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's like essentially you're going to sell your children up the river because this is something you don't understand and you're scared of. And that's exactly where we're at. And it's very interesting because to me, like this is like very deeply like fourth turning of that. Like we have like a bunch of weak individuals who have gotten themselves in power. I mean, here in the United States, like it's absolutely insane. Like we had Feinstein who literally said like, I can't take care of myself, so my child will. Like I can still be part of Congress and make votes.
Was she still in power at the last fourth turning?
I'm pretty sure she was there at like...
She's done one full cycle.
Well, she signed the Declaration of Independence, didn't she?
Jesus. Yeah. Well, actually, let me just sidestep a second. Have you taken an equal interest in Nostar?
Yeah. I'm like I was really happy that Nostar came out like right before I got my book all together, because being called Cryptosovereignty and like a group of Bitcoiners that hate the word crypto, like I'm a little on the defensive here. And the reason why I title it that is because like Bitcoin obviously is like the preeminent social contract that we've built through cryptography, but it's very important that like the praxis of why it works is fundamentally that social contract that cryptography has now actualized. So to me, it's very, very important to understand that like cryptography is the thing that gives us this new form of sovereignty in the technological age. And like this is one of the reasons that like, I don't want to say I defend shitcoins in the book, but like I make a pretty strong reservation saying like, look, like we need to have the development of robust cryptography so that like if Bitcoin fails, if there's any number of things that are going on, that like we have all of these backup theorems to be able to help us. So to me, the big thing is that like cryptography in and of itself provides this new form of sovereignty. And so seeing Nostar get up and running essentially using the same format as Bitcoin was really, really exciting. And also particularly on the back end of all of this social censorship that we're seeing with people like Brand and others, that it's really important that we not only have Bitcoin, but we have decentralized media. And I want to see an entire stack of tools that we can use, you know, and like VoIP is a really good one. Like for a long time, we thought Signal was going to be that, but it turns out that like it's a lot more of a corporate tool than we thought.
So cryptography is basically the way we can avoid becoming digital serfs in this new system.
I think it's the only way. Like I don't see any other plausibility other than asking people to take the responsibility of self-sovereignty onto themselves and actually start protecting their data in thoughtful and meaningful ways, or supporting organizations that do that for them.
Because privacy is fundamental.
It's not even that it's fundamental. Like this is like, and there's a great essay in here called the Sovereign, the Subject, and Crypto Power, where I pretty much make the argument that like identity is the primary function that the state utilizes to be able to assess whether or not somebody's friend or enemy, and that like vis-a-vis identity, like that's always the function that the state utilizes to brand its enemies and then use to destroy it. So like if we can't allow for them to identify us from the start, there's like no foothold for them to be able to get placement of that. And I think it's really important because, like, as much as like we might be good citizens doing good things, like if you're a Jew and it turns out that like there's a neo-Nazi political power movement that actually gets into power, like now there's a very, very serious problem of you being a Jew, even though that's just a fundamental thing about your identity. And it was funny because when I gave my lecture in Riga, somebody pointed out to me that like in Holland, when the Nazis were invading, like they would go to the library and get the books that documented like who everybody was and where they lived. And this is how they located all the Jews. And there was like some heroic Dutch people who understood this, and they like rode ahead of the Nazis, got to the local libraries and burned them down, which was like, you know, burning down a library is not good, but for this purpose it was. And that like those regions that they did that, like 40% more of the Jews survived.
Huh. You know, in Lebanon, you have to have your religion on your passport. It blew my mind because I was like, well, I'm atheist. It's like, no, it's Christian or I don't know if it's all 19
religions. Can you do the
religions.
Pastafarian thing there?
I don't know because it's like, I think it's 18 or 19 religions there, but I don't know if some of them are just like forks of like Christianity.
So when you have a censorship in in the UK and people put like
Jedi.
like Jedi,
yeah. But you have to have your religion on your passport.
Wow.
So that's part of your identity there because there's a very strong Christian community, a very strong Sunni community, very strong Shiite community. But I don't know if it's just like if it's all 18 or it's just those three. I'd have to ask somebody. But yeah, just the idea that you have to have your religion on your passport. I was like, that's kind of fucked up. But it's more fucked up now. Thinking about what you're saying.
Well, like this is sort of interesting in that like this gets more into the metaphysical discussion that I'm really interested in. Is that like Satoshi Nakamoto presented himself as like the truest metaphysical other that there could never be, because he's like a being that's a non-being, and he presented himself in such a way that we can like never know him. And furthermore, like if we did know him, that would like fundamentally threaten like his physical existence. And to me, like going all the way back to what we were talking about earlier about critiquing Heidegger, one of Heidegger's students, Levinas, he was a Jew, and he was horrified by all the things that Heidegger did, and he wrote his own critique of Heidegger in a book called Totality and Infinity. And every time I read Totality and Infinity, like I'm moved to tears because he has this eloquent opening where he's asking like, is the fundamental condition of man one of war? Like, are we absolutely doomed to live under these conditions that we've seen forever and under the metaphysical ideal that we can justify the killing of the other, or is there something else that's a possibility? So he developed an idea that he calls meontology, which is counter to Heidegger's idea of being the preeminent idea of what philosophy is about, the idea of to be. It's non-being. It's about the other, and reserving a space to say that from the other, the metaphysics of all possibility come. Because inside of myself, there's a totality that I can never get beyond, that I can never teach myself certain things. I can't expose myself to divine revelation. However, through me honoring the other and not having any power over them, and furthermore, presenting to myself an ethics first and foremost of honoring that other and saying, no, there is no conditions ever by which I may violate the other, we actually advance ethics itself to becoming the first philosophy that is in the advancement of philosophy. Just because it is only through that ethical praxis of saying that the other is allowed to exist that the entirety of language and philosophy can actually come out of that.
That's almost... Tell me if you think I'm right. That's almost what Mark was saying in the last one.
What do you mean?
Well, Mark, we had this long conversation with Mark Moss, and we went down a religion, he would say not religion, but religion rabbit hole. I'm atheist, and he's, I don't want to say it wrong. He believes in the writings of Jesus. That's the best way of putting it, rather than say Christian.
He believes in a creator.
Yes.
Cool.
And where does morality come from? And I was saying it's just in me. And he says, well, a lot of his comes from the writings of Jesus. But he said the world would be a better place if we all live by the rule of love the other person more than you love yourself.
Sure. And I mean, like that.
I feel like you've just said the same thing in a different way.
That's like a really warm and fuzzy thing, right?
But it feels like the same end goal.
Well, I'd say like the difference is that like Satoshi executed that same thought, but with like the most radical praxis possible. Because you could say, I want to love the other as I love myself. And like the problem is that humans are these terrible fork-tongued liars that will essentially make any excuse they can to murder the other. So how about I build a money behind cryptography and shield my own identity with perfect forward secrecy in such a way so that no one can ever actually physically locate me if they want to?
Because it also feels like it's along the lines of this kind of non-aggression principle that a lot of libertarians talk about. But the problem with the non-aggression principle, it only works if everyone adheres to it.
Well, this is where like the internet gets super interesting.
Well, this is, I think, where Bitcoin gets super interesting. Like, if you consider in terms of money, part of the non-aggression principle would not to steal from somebody else. But humans are flawed, so rather than not steal, can't steal.
Yes, and like that's the most important one. Is very similar to like instead of like don't be evil, like can't be evil, and like this is to me like this
That's
is the
Blockstream from Google.
Yes, because you know how Google we're like, man, we're like doing a bunch of evil stuff.
We better take this out.
We better change the motto. And it's like, no, you guys got the message wrong.
This came out of my Christian Decker interview. Did you listen to that?
Not yet.
Yeah, so I interviewed Christian Decker and we talked about this because, Google were don't be evil. And then they removed it. And I was like, so you're basically admitting either you are evil or you're going to be evil, but like you're okay with that. You haven't gone, actually, all that shit we're doing that's evil, or we're going to do this evil, let's stop doing that. It's like, no, let's be evil. It was like a really weird confession by billionaires.
Well, and like I need to publish this essay I've worked on for a long time. It's like this all goes back to Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil that she wrote about Eichmann in Jerusalem. Are you familiar with this?
Nope.
So essentially, Eichmann was the guy that was in charge of conducting the trains that shipped all the people off to the Holocaust. He escaped after World War II, went to Argentina to party with all of his Nazi friends. Mossad didn't like that so much, so they found him in 1962, black-bagged him, brought him back. They put him on trial for the Holocaust, and in it, it's really interesting. He like mounts a defense saying that like he's actually like a very good German citizen, that he upholds Kantian ideals and ethics, and that he was committed to the sense of duty that he had as like a good German citizen. And his argument was like, if as good German citizens we're like disobeying the law and like not doing our duty to the law, like the entirety of society descends into that. And so like I'm not guilty because I was just following my duty. And Arendt's response was pretty much like, look at this midwit buffoon. Like we actually come to him with like an ethical question about how he participated in the murder of millions of people. And like he can't even actually address that directly and avoids it and gives all of this other reasoning. She was like, and this was why evil's banal, is that like it doesn't take some special evilness or some wicked-mindedness. It simply requires a man not to be capable of thinking about what he's actually doing. She was like, so the truth is that when we encounter evil, it has nothing to do with how they respond to it. It has to do with how we respond to it. So to me, like what I really get from Bitcoin and what's going on with the world and all of the nihilism is like, this is an ethical question that's presented to me alone. Am I going to choose to put my wealth in Bitcoin? And am I going to choose to use it as I want? And furthermore, when the state comes to me to tax me or hurt me for the ideas of my ethical praxis, will I actually say, no, I will not? Or actually, in reference to the book, I'll say, I would prefer not to, which is a reference to a quote from Herman Melville in a short story called Bartleby, the Scrivener of Wall Street, and just his refusal to participate in anything.
I prefer not to suggest that you can be pushed, so you have to.
Well,
is there like a deeper meaning?
There's a deeper meaning, and essentially in the story, it's about the radical individual choice to just refuse to participate in any meaningful way whatsoever because that's the decision that you've made. And that by you just simply refusing to do. Because like this escalates all the way to like Bartleby works for the lawyer. He refuses to do any work every time he comes out. And like the lawyer's like a good lawyer. He's like, could you just do some work, Bartleby? And he's like, I'd prefer not to. And like the lawyer's kind of driven insane by this. And like he doesn't want to hurt Bartleby. So he's like, like fuck it. I'll just like move out of my office. I don't want anything to do this. But Bartleby like actually stays there. And like the next tenant who comes, like same thing. Like you got to get out of here. I'd prefer not to. Thrown in jail. In jail, he starts refusing to take food. The lawyer comes and visits him. He's really concerned about Bartleby. Bartleby continues, says, I prefer not to. Comes back a couple days later, Bartleby's dead. And it ends the story with him just kind of being in existential angst about it. And he's like, oh, Bartleby, oh, humanity. And to me, like, this is literally just about how individuals can make radical choices for themselves, whether it seems logical or not. And that vis-a-vis the refusal, you actually create the preeminent form of personalized political power that exists.
Okay. Anyone listening thinking, why is there a pause? I'm processing this. And one thing I am realizing, I need to read a lot more books. I've started with crypto sovereignty. So, by the way, and the thing with Blockstream is they decided their motto or their tagline will be "Can't be evil."
Yeah.
Which I really like.
Yeah,
It's a nice touch. Okay, so we all go on these Bitcoin journeys and these Bitcoin rabbit holes, and we decide where that's going to take us and what we're going to do with it. I don't know.
we decide this.
Well, I kind of think you do. I think. Well, do we have free will?
I mean, I just kind of laugh at it because, like, the first time I met Gigi, him and I had this really great conversation where, like, about 5 minutes in, I was like, look, like, God came to us. He, like, told us all this. He gave us the understanding that we know and understand to be Bitcoin. We went all in on it. We went through a couple cycles. Like, we can just go away now and, like, live a happy, peachy keen life by ourselves doing whatever we want. But for some reason, you and I are here in the middle of the rain in Miami talking to each other about our zealous commitments to this thing we call Bitcoin. Why?
Yeah, well, that is why and what will you do with it? Because we all can do different things. I don't particularly read a lot about Bitcoin. I don't think about it deeply. I spend more time in the action of trying to get it to people. But you've made the decision to go down the rabbit hole of thinking about it deeply. You've done a lot more of the why.
And like that wasn't like compelled by me. Like there's just like a splinter in my mind that like it drives me absolutely insane that there's this money that's like becoming the most powerful thing in human history. It's like slowly accumulating more and more money. And like every doofus in academia is like, nah, it's a scam. Like it doesn't work. It consumes too much energy. And like we're just getting the dumbest possible answers from the people that are purportedly smart. And to me, like this just blew my mind. I was like, how? Like I remember when the crisis in 2013 happened, where Cyprus did the bail-ins, and we like watched the rally up, and we got all the same dialogue, and I was like, this doesn't make any sense. There's like something really big going on here that no one's thinking about, and I don't understand why. And as I started going through all of the reading, I realized because like it's dealing with this massive concourse of human history that because of where we're at in the general advancement of academia and where purported philosophy stands at this point in time, like they have nothing to do with the intellectual process of trying to understand stuff. Like all that they have to do is with their own generalized authority that's created to be self-referential to themselves and their own importance, which means stuff like accepting that Bitcoin is a really, really important development in humanity can't be accepted by academia because they've missed it for the last 12 years. So to me, as I dived in, I felt a personal ethical responsibility to say, there's something really important going on here. I need to know what it is. Like, I'm not a philosopher. Like, hell, I don't even think I'm very smart. Like, I
would disagree with both of those points, but carry on.
I like to think that, like, I'm just a philosophical remixer. Like, I read this stuff and I go, huh, this, like, fit, like, you just, like, plug Bitcoin in, like, derp to derp. Like, turns out this is, like, a totally new political theory. And like, it's super hilarious how often, like, I'll read very deep philosophy and, like, I'll show you guys my copy of On Contributions after this. It's just like insane margin notes like Bitcoin, like Bitcoin. Because like they're literally describing Bitcoin from a phenomenological standpoint. They just don't have a word for it. And so it's really amazing that like even in the essay I'm reading right now by Diodera about metaphysics and violence, which is like a reading of an essay in here called Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence. He like makes this point that like in the future we could like have a super language that like is a grammar without words that can be like self-referential in a way that doesn't have to do like the double metaphor that words do whenever they're referring to things. And I'm like that's Bitcoin. Like that's obviously Bitcoin. It's like a super language project.
You've got one part that for me. I don't understand what that means.
Oh, which part?
Like everything that like what did you say the grammar thing is?
Oh, a grammar without words.
So what? Oh yeah, what's that?
So that's just like a rule set because so it's the idea of that like essentially we get a proof or we don't get a proof, and like so every time that we have a transaction in Bitcoin, we get like a TXID, and that TXID is. I would say it's like a name for that very specific event of like you and me doing an exchange for that one time in human history. And like that's the one word for that one event that can like never ever be repeated for any reason. And what that word does is it doesn't sit inside of a sentence. It has a full grammar of its own where it can say yes, yes, no, no. And that's the only thing it can say. And like that advances language in this very powerful way where there's like a hyper resolution that like we can't make statements in Bitcoin and have them be wrong.
So why does that advance language?
Because now instead of me being like, hey, like is this glass half empty or half full? Like we can never get to the answer, right? Because there's always the metaphor of how you're going to interpret it. Like language itself has this fundamental problem, right? And this is the entire problem that we have in contractual language, is we like write it out, like I want this, you want that. Somehow the contract gets violated. Now we have to go through this whole adjudication process. Whereas with Bitcoin, when we have the transaction, it's either valid or it's not. There's no room for misinterpretation as there is with standardized language. And through that concept specifically vis-a-vis language, we now are able to take out all of this idea of the contractual obligations and what we do in their violations. We just make it so there can't be one.
But does language, when talking about maths, not have the exact same thing?
Say more.
Like if there's a definitive answer to like a maths problem, there's no interpretation in that.
Yes.
Is that not the same as what you're describing with Bitcoin?
Well, and that's what I'm saying is that like that definitive answer that is a yes or is a no definitively changes the entire operation of what we're doing with language here. Because like no longer is it just about us trying to understand what's going on in terms of, you know, you got a bunch of apples, I buy the apples from you for the $5, I go away. You go, hang on, wait a minute. Like I actually only meant like you could buy one apple for that. And I was like, well, no, I thought you meant all the apples because you said like you can buy the apples for it. And now we're in this entire problem, right? Whereas if you have your listing for like, I got my 5 apples here, here's the bucket. I send you Bitcoin, I got the bucket of apples. I can't get my Bitcoin back no matter what because like we did that transaction. And so like what I'm trying to focus on is that through the cryptographic clausing of language itself, there isn't any room for the interpretation to be done in a different way. It's just yes, yes, no, no. And then this becomes extra efficient throughout time because like as we build out a monetary system, now I can see if like what the chain of history of all of this money is. Like has it been stolen before? Has it been used or abused in different ways? And this is one of the ways that like we can look at through the chain of history of Bitcoin transactions and say that the vast majority of all transactions have been consensual transactions between two people as opposed to somebody getting beaten over the head and having it taken, which that has happened a number of times, but the whole system can't rely on that function.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So back to my other point is we go on these journeys. I'm not too into the why. I haven't gone down the rabbit hole of the why. I just take it as it is. And I know it's brilliant and it does these simple things that I need it to do, and I know other people can benefit from that. And I also know it has the simple rule set, very simple monetary policy, and for some reason that makes money better. I just know this, and that's enough for me to then go on the journey I need to do, which is to travel as far and wide as possible and tell as many people as possible about this. But you have done the why, or you're doing the why. Maybe you're always doing the why. So what have you discovered in the why? I'm so crap at interviewing philosophers or people who care about philosophy. I think it's mainly because I've understood about half of what you've told me.
Sorry, I can be both loquacious and like I'm like referencing things in sentences.
I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna re-listen to this.
So what was the question again?
So what is the why? You've gone down the why rabbit hole. Why does this work? And what have you found?
One, I've found that like it's profoundly personally transforming, like as you wrestle with the questions. So like it does that to you personally in a way that's like very unexpected.
But I think that's done that to me without doing the why. I think it's transformed me as a human.
Well, I think it's like doing the why in the background in a way that like maybe you're not
subliminal why.
Yeah.
Or is it just a forcing function of how I've had to adapt to a different form of money because that's where I store my money and that's just changed everything?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's something you should think about and consider asking yourself why. In all honesty, like at the deepest levels, what I think Bitcoin represents is a return to truth in a world that is entirely nihilistic, in a world that has spent generations after the death of God, convincing ourselves that there is no truth, there is no right, there is no justice, there is no wrong, that all things are subjective, it turns out that like there actually is like a capital T truth. It's very muddled and hard to find, but like mathematics itself is a place that we can like get pretty rigid and definitive answers. And through us building a language on top of these advanced mathematics that are produced through a crypto system, it means that we can now build a monetary system that allows for full and true accounting, that allows for accountability. And it's sort of ironic that this word accounting and accountability go together, because like the actual accounting of the fiat system does not have any accountability. Like it is mathematically erroneous, and like we can't actually make the system function. Like, you know, if we total everything up, it doesn't total in a way that makes sense. And that's like a fundamental and inherent lie that the entire world works with. And that's how we operate through a lot of the world. And so I think for many people when they come into Bitcoin, myself particularly included, the world is a very, very dark place. And there is no possibility of ever rescuing or recovering ourselves from the conditions that it's in. And what Bitcoin presents is a possibility that maybe we could. Like an extremely radical possibility that maybe we could get the power of the purse to the state back under the hands of democratic control, and that through that we can actually have limiting governmental powers in a way that is sensible and reasonable in the ways that we believe they should be. Because today, like we live in a hyper status world that really is behaving like extremely overbearing fathers. You know, like the fact that if any of us want to go visit one another anywhere in the world, like we have to have literal permission slips from our government to go to or from to see each other. Whether that's necessary or not isn't the point. The fact is that we're not allowed for the agency as human beings to truly think for ourselves and come about the conclusions that we believe to be true for ourselves. And it's been this, and to me, like this is the core function of what's gone horrifically wrong, is that we've forgotten how to think. And when I say thinking, I'm specifically referring to the action of questioning something and then assembling a chain of proof of work that is self-referential back to that own work to make a logical concourse and a conclusion. Most people actually use a proof of stake methodology where they just point to general authorities and say that's the correct answer, and we move forward with that. That has nothing to do with thinking because it doesn't involve questioning in any meaningful way. Like that's fundamentally what thinking is at its base, is it's asking the question of saying, why? Why is this working? How is it doing it? What is its process? And then when you see it that way, you go, is this true? Like, is this actually right? Am I mistaken about it? And it's ironic because this is the hypothesis and the scientific process playing out. It's not saying, well, a scientist told me that that's the right answer, so it is. It's saying, I don't know. Like if you have criticism about it, please let me know. I'm really curious. And I mean, that's really why I wrote my book. Like maybe this is all absolute insane bullshit. I don't think it is. Like it totally could be. And I hope somebody reads it and they go, this is insane bullshit. And I have a strong philosophical critique for it. And I absolutely welcome it. Because like, to me, this is a pursuit of trying to figure out like, am I wrong about Bitcoin? I really want to know. Because like, if I'm not wrong about Bitcoin, then I believe that this is the most radical apparatus that has ever put its hands in humanity, and that is the only thing that can save us from the potential annihilation of total war that we are eking towards closer and closer every day. You know, as we were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before, what we're both watching there is absolutely horrific and is heartbreaking, no matter who is dying. And the simple truth is that we don't have any meaningful way to push back against that. And what I want to say is with Bitcoin, there becomes the possibility of withholding your wealth from governments that are doing that. Is it going to end war tomorrow? Absolutely not. Is it going to end war on a total? Probably not. Does this radically limit the state's ability and capacity to be able to develop weapons and then utilize your money to finance those wars? I think it can if it integrates itself into a large holistic political movement. But we won't really know until we see something like that.
Okay, so I think I've taken three specific components of this that are really important. There's the cryptography, but there's the math. In that, I guess math is the only language you can't you can't lie, you can't fix it. Math is math, right? Math is truth. It's not 1984. 2 + 2 can't equal 5. Has to equals 4, and therefore the fact that it's built on math, it has to be true. Everything that happens has to be true. But I also then would just add in the 21 million being a super important part of that. In that the 21 million forces us to, rather than live in that kind of fiat inflating money world, we have to live in a world where we have to think about money, and there's an incentive to hold it and think about the future. So there's math, time preference, and cryptography. I think are 3 important pillars of this.
The only one I'd add also is on the back end, like the actual computational energy that's utilized, because like that also has like an extremely important component for the formation of the system. But I would say like those 4 things together.
But is that a pillar, or is that just something it needs for it to operate?
I think it's a pillar.
Okay.
Specifically because, and like ironically enough, like a lot of this like lines up with what the stuff Jason Laurie was saying. I don't agree with him, and I think like we're pretty much looking at the same thing from opposite sides. But I do think that the actual real energetical use that's being used creates incentives both in energy production, but also in terms of protecting the Bitcoin system on a whole, because there becomes an actual incentive to plug in. Like if there's a state-based attack that's going on, there becomes a very large incentive for you to just plug in your miner and get going, not only to defend the network, but because there's an actual economic imperative that like you can make pretty good money if you start mining while there's, a fork war going on by choosing either side and getting the dump on one side or the other, in addition to the way that the actual utility on the network's been chopped in half or whatever.
So the energy is the defense against the state.
Well, it's funny, and there's a lot of stuff I'm working on for my second book. It's the computation, but the computation is essentially fused with energy at this point in time. And so like that allows for the bulk ward against the state, as it's always classically been. And it's that like, it turns out that like a one-way hash function is like really hard to undo. And that was like the same thing that was true 3,000 years ago in Sparta when they were using rudimentary cryptography with a stick and leather that was called a skytail. Same thing. It was just hard to figure out what was being used, hard enough that they couldn't figure it out while war was going on.
So do you sit there then sometimes and think about Bitcoin and think, this is incredibly, it's like almost unbelievable we've got this. This is like a gift. This is such beautifully perfect design. Or do you think it was inevitable we would get something like Bitcoin because of the way we were going?
It's like both that
Yeah.
fuse up into a single entity.
Yeah.
And so like I have an essay in here called Bitcoin is Messianic.
Yeah.
Because like I truly believe if you look at the entire historicism of man and relating back to that figure Homo Sacer, like there's always been the potentiality for individuals to be declared enemies by the state, have their wealth extracted from them, be destroyed. Like that like essentially is the story of humanity. And now we have a money that even when somebody comes to destroy me, if I make the ethical choice to say no, or more accurately, if I like put it into like a nice multi-sig contract that I don't even have control over, like I can't get that money. Like that's something that's actually transformational in the entire concourse of human history. But even more importantly, I think what Satoshi, and there's another essay in this called Theory of the Crypto Partisan, Satoshi actually opened up a totally new topology of war vis-a-vis the internet, and then he created a money for that new topology. And so to me, like this now becomes the rebel territory that new actors get to essentially engage in their telluric global civil war against states in. And there's really nothing that they can do to find these people. And that's what Satoshi Nakamoto proved and essentially provided a reservation for with and what really kind of started part of this journey was that quote that he says where it's in response to somebody says, like we will not win wars against the state using cryptography. But Satoshi responds with, yes, but we can win a new territory of freedom for several years. The state's very good at cutting off the heads of centralized entities, but pure P2P entities like Gunella and Tor are holding their own. To me, that's a reservation of this specific space and territory that we can utilize for ourselves to achieve the freedom that's not only rightfully ours, but that we both have a responsibility and dignity to give to posterity. Because the truth is like, with what just happened in the UK, like that's a very real crisis thing. And if we don't take responsibility as the humans of today to address these issues, our children will live in these open-air prison camps for forever, and probably their grandchildren and grandchildren, and it will solidify in a way that we can never actually fight it or win against it.
Is the Ready Player One pod an open air prison camp?
100%, yeah.
Can we be in the gulag and play together?
Well, so we went down the 1984 versus, or how do you say his name? Aldous Huxley?
Aldous Huxley, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We went down that route. We had an AI conversation yesterday.
Okay.
And if that leads to towards a capitalist singularity where there's no jobs to be done because none of us have to do jobs, and what will that present to us? And we discussed the idea, well, the way technology is going, and that we may end up with the pod, with Ready Player One. We can do whatever we want in that world. We can go and, life itself might feel mundane for so many people because they don't have the money to go and do anything. So do we put people in the pod with the Ready Player One and let them go and live the exact world they want to be? You want to play football for Man U? You can. You want to be a rock star? You can. Rather than keep them into the kind of mundane, unplugged world where everything's controlled by a few corporate entities. It sounds super like futuristic, dystopian, and unrealistic, but actually you can also draw a path to it and say, well, maybe it does. So I'm just wondering,
Pete's getting in the pod and I refuse.
Look, I'm going to go in the pod and I'm going to score a winning goal in the World Cup final for England at Wembley. I'm definitely going to do that. And I'm probably going to play guitar for Metallica.
But you didn't really do it.
But I did. but what is real?
So this is like that Matrix scene where Cypher is eating the steak, and he's like, I know it's not real. I know that it's not in my mouth. I know that this is all a fantasy. He was like, but it tastes so good. Like, why should I deny it? Yeah, and then he asked to be made like a movie star and put back into the machine. I think it's really interesting because, we probably will be able to get those lifestyles. Same thing with, we're probably going to get, our AI porn stars who can, do all of the crazy stuff that we want to with us. And technology is going to give us access to
Always
all of
comes
these.
back to porn.
Oh, well, that's part of what we desire as people. But I think it's really important that, these are all fictionalized experiences, right? And, now it starts asking, what is an existence like that? Is it an existence? Is it something else?
But that's why I said to Danny yesterday, I was like, well, isn't it essentially the same as mushrooms or acid? Isn't acid a fictionalized experience?
No. To me, that's the realest experience that there is. My consciousness is something that I'm certain of. I'm inside of it, right? It's me, I'm it. I can verify it because I'm present inside of it. It's all this other stuff outside of me that I can't get. And from me and my own practices with psychedelics, I'm convinced this place doesn't really exist, and it's not because I think it's fake or anything. It's that I think that there's a totally different means and order of consciousness that when we do stuff like psychedelics, we get to touch it a little bit and play with it. And the truth is that coming away from those experiences, they're so profound and magical and divine. I can't deny the nature of what those things are. And so whether that's true or not, it leaves me coming back into this place with much deeper questioning about what is the actual nature of this.
So
and is this actually real?
So this doesn't really exist. So if this doesn't really exist, then it doesn't matter whether you're in the pod in Ready Player One because neither exist.
But it's another degree of separation, isn't it?
Separation from what?
Consciousness.
Is it closer to it?
Well,
why?
Well, I just present that so you live your life in the pod. It's a great life. You die. Now what happens?
No, I just want to have a go in the pod. I want to play Grand Theft Auto sometimes. That's
you really think you're going to go in the pod and they're going to be like, okay, you can get out now? You think that's how it works?
I think the early pod, it's like MetaQuest, and I can just buy it at Amazon and take it home and have a go.
Oh, yeah. I really love how the betas are always things that people really want in on. They're yeah, I want to lock myself in my pod and jack myself up with a bunch of suppressing hormones. That sounds really good.
I want to play Grand Theft Auto or Crossy Road and I just want to play guitar for Metallica, just one concert.
So in all honesty, I don't think the pods and stuff are going to happen. I think it's a really fun technological future that they present to us. But the truth is these very powerful people, I don't see why they're not just going to use the classic open-air prison model effect. It just seems to be much more efficient and easier to corral people in there. So I think that's the direction they'll go. But, maybe for the upper middle class, they'll have pods or something nice like that. I'm not sure.
Oh my God, this is unbelievable. This is so much fun. This is the way to finish a trip, man.
100%.
I don't like reading books. I'm not a book reader, but I feel like I'm going to have to read this one. Is there an audiobook?
They've been bullying me to like get that done, and I really need to get it done. And I really want to do it because I'd really like to, like in between each chapter, like have like a sit down with somebody who read the chapter and having like a long dialogue. So if that does come out, it's probably gonna be at the end of the year when I actually get to sit down and do all of it.
I think I need to read this book.
See, this was really my strategy. I was like, I know Pete doesn't like to read, so if I just don't do the audiobook, he's forced to read.
Yeah, but you know what it is? Usually because I've got limited time, and when people are coming in because they've done a book, I'm like, they get to explain to me most of what the book's about in 2 hours. But this is different. I
don't think if we had 20 hours, we could do it.
No, I actually want to read it and then do this again.
The fun thing is, like, because of the way that they're all written as sort of standalone essays, like each one can kind of be picked out on its own and just read sort of standalone as a thought. And that's why I've also said that, like, this is sort of a constellation of incomplete thoughts of mine. And so what I'm working on now is like a much more larger holistic theory that's trying to take Heidegger's event and essentially like analyze Bitcoin through that process. Like, this is all I'm really like, I sound like a super smart book guy, but all I do is like read Heidegger and then I'm like plug Bitcoin in and like write an essay about it. I'm like, haha, I'm smart now.
It's actually a hard interview because you are thinking at a level that it's just out of my depth. It's like when I interview Andrew Polstra and he's talking to me about CK rollups or some fucking technical bullshit. And I've just got no idea. It is another level for me. It's a hard interview. It's hard but it's enjoyable. Like it's one you can really enjoy, but struggle. I don't think I do you the justice it deserves. I can see why you and Gigi have a great conversation, which is why I want to go and read it now, and then do and sit down with you again. I'll probably be texting you and go.
I just got to ask you, like, when
this is a
like when you struggle with it, because like what I find really is like when I struggle with something. To me, that's like double down. Like, I have to figure it out now.
No, it's more like sometimes when you know, earlier, and Danny said, hold on, you need to unpack that for me again. If I'd have done that every time I wanted to, we would be here for probably 8 hours. And I also sometimes would probably want to sit down and write and figure out. I'm slow to process certain things. It's more that. But it's a compliment to you and it's a criticism of me being a dumbass. But I'm going to read this book now, and I really want to read it. And I really want to do this again.
Yeah, and and like again, I would absolutely love your feedback. Even for like chapter 3 was just like insane. You obviously like did Daratua and then like wrote this. So you need to level back, Cason.
How do people get hold of the book and get hold of you?
Best way to get a hold of the book is Bitcoin Magazine is selling it. You can order it there. If you're an Amazon person, probably going on Amazon, ordering it will be the best way. If you want to follow me, the best way is on Twitter. It's just my name, Erik Cason on Twitter. I'm on Nostr as well, if you're there. And also, I'm going to be presenting at Bitcoin Amsterdam next week. I don't think this will be out before that, and at the Bali conference. But I'm kind of a regular on these circuits, and people like my kind of insane ranting style. So I think I'll probably be doing it for a while. And
we've got a Bedford conference for you.
Oh, okay. You're going to do it. You're going to do
it. Yeah, next April. We'll tell you about it in a minute.
All right, incredible.
Erik, amazing. So much fun.
That was a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.